Hi, everyone. So last week we started with an overview of who students with disabilities are in terms of the 13 IDEA disability categories. Today we're going to be digging deeper into how students are identified and what the data show us about representation by disability type, gender, and race and ethnicity. Let's start with what happens before a student is referred to special education, because it's usually a longer process than many people realize. Schools need to show that a student has had access to high quality instruction and interventions first. That's where RTI, or response to intervention, comes in. This process can be very procedural, but that's intentional. The goal is to be proactive, to prevent learning issues from happening or from getting worse, rather than waiting until a child has already failed significantly before we offer help. In fact, the response to intervention, RTI, came about as a response to what's often called the wait to fail model. The wait to fail model is an older approach taken to identify students with disabilities. And though it's an older approach, without some of these more procedural processes in place, the wait to fail model will become the default and has been proven to become the default. In the wait to fail model, students don't get additional supports until they have already proven that they have failed over and over again. And only then are they considered eligible or likely to be eligible for special education. By then, valuable time and learning has been lost. The response to intervention model shifts the focus to earlier identification and earlier support, hopefully preventing kids from failing. Now, ideally, this pyramid on the right-hand side of the screen looks familiar to you. This is the response to intervention pyramid. If it looks familiar, it's because RTI is part of the bigger framework that you should already have had some experience with. It's the multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS. MTSS includes not only academics, but also behavior and social emotional supports. RTI is just the academic piece. And here it plays a huge role in making sure referrals to special education are based on real documented needs and not just a single bad test score or a hunch or some internal feeling we're having. Now, as we know in the MTSS model, which includes RTI, tier 1 is for everyone. It's your high quality instruction in the general education classroom with ongoing monitoring to catch students who might be struggling. Tier 2 adds more targeted small group interventions for students who need a boost, along with frequent progress checks. And tier 3 is intensive individualized support. If a student isn't making progress even at that level, that's when a referral for special education might be the most appropriate option. Now, as a general education teacher, you're often the first to notice when something doesn't seem quite right for a student. Maybe they're struggling to keep up in reading, or you've tried different strategies and nothing seems to stick. For example, imagine a third grader who isn't recognizing sight words after months of small group practice, even though most of their classmates are moving forward. That's a red flag. It's signaling that it's time to bring your concerns to the student support team, or SST, so that the school can take a closer look. It's also important to know that parents don't have to wait for the school to act. If they also suspect something isn't quite right or they have concerns about their child's learning, they can request an evaluation at any time, at any grade, at any stage of the child's learning. This request has to be provided in writing in California, but let's say a parent asks verbally or is in a meeting and then asks. In that situation, school staff are required to help them put that request into writing because, again, documentation is everything. So once a request is made, the school has 15 days to respond with an assessment plan, meaning that on my side, let's say I'm the school administrator, I received a request. I'm going to gather all of my initial evidence. I'm going to get the right team members in place, and we're going to create an assessment plan. Because within 15 days, we have to figure out who's available, what are we doing, why are we doing this? We have to make a plan for it. We give that plan to the parents. Parents then have another 15 days to review that plan, to ask for changes, or to decide whether or not they want to actually move forward in that process. In most situations, evaluations cannot move forward without the parents' written consent. This also means that sometimes the process stops here. Families may choose to pursue outside evaluations. They may be very hesitant to move forward, or they have really strong feelings about special education and their child's learning. Maybe they think a different environment is better than going full through with special education processes. However, when the parents do give consent for this process to continue, the evaluation and the subsequent individualized education program, or IEP, meeting that must occur or must take place within 60 days of those evaluations. So in short, identification usually begins with a referral, and that referral can come from you, from a parent, or sometimes even from another specialist working with the student. Now, general educators are not ever really the ones doing the special education evaluation tests, but your role is absolutely critical in that process. You're the person who provides the data that shows what's working and what's not, what supports have already been tried, and you're also often the main point of connection for the families at this point, which makes clear and compassionate communication very important. That's why your documentation matters so much. Noting what you've observed in the classroom, the strategies and the interventions you've implemented, and the conversations you've had with families and colleagues. This record helps ensure the process is fair, it's evidence-based, and also helps reassure parents that their child is being seen to, is being supported, is being understood, even if what comes after might be difficult to work with or to understand. So when it comes to referrals, there are also some things that general education teachers should avoid doing. First, right here, we do not refer students because they haven't had enough appropriate instruction in areas like reading or math, right? If a student is behind, we need to make sure that they have had access to high quality instruction and interventions before jumping to special education. Sometimes that evidence is very simple to have. No, they have not. And here's the proof that they have somehow, for whatever reasons, not received this level of education that they needed to. And other times, the proof is also just as easy to pull up. Yes, we have been doing everything according to our RTI triangle. Everybody's getting so many supports. Second, we do not refer students solely because of limited English proficiency. Language acquisition is not a disability, and if we confuse the two, we risk misidentifying multilingual learners. You'd think I wouldn't have to say this. This is actually a huge issue in the world of special education, and it really might be geographically dependent. So the third here is we do not refer students based on temporary situations, like if they're going through a tough time at home, they're recovering from an extended illness, or adjusting to a new school. Those factors can affect learning, but they do not necessarily mean a disability is present. So what should you do instead? We should document what you've taught, what supports and strategies you've tried, and any cultural or linguistic factors that may be affecting that student's learning. This kind of evidence helps make sure that the referral process is fair, it's accurate, and truly is in the best interest of that student. Now, when we talk about special education evaluations, there's a lot in there. We need to know generally what are they, who conducts them, and what happens after. So we'll start with what kind of evaluations are conducted. When a student is referred to special education, the law requires that they be assessed in all areas related to that suspected disability. That does not just mean academics. It can include health, vision, hearing, language, motor skills, cognitive ability, social and emotional support areas, and other areas as well. The idea is to build a complete picture of the student and not just focus on the latest test score or grade or teacher observation. We need the whole picture. Assessments that are used in this stage must be valid, meaning that they have a lot of statistical proof and data behind them to be valid assessments to assess and identify potential disabilities. They must be culturally responsive and given in the student's primary language so that the results are accurate and fair. Second, who conducts those actual evaluations? So evaluations are conducted by a team of qualified professionals from different backgrounds, and it depends on the child's needs. So for example, a school psychologist might handle the cognitive intellectual-based testing. Special educator may also do this kind of testing. It depends who's available and what the training of the special ed teacher is at that point. A speech language pathologist might assess communication. Other specialists could be looking at health-related, motor ability areas, or emotional status. Importantly, as general educators, you also contribute to the evaluation. Your observations, documentation of class supports, and input about how the student learns and behaves on a day-to-day are essential pieces to that puzzle. And likely, some of these evaluators will come ask for your perspective as well. Now, what happens after those evaluations are done? Once those evaluations are complete, the district or the school has to hold an IEP meeting within 60 days. At this meeting, the team, which now includes the parents, the general ed teacher, the special ed teacher, and any of those specialists who gave assessments and are giving recommendations, all of them are going to get together and they're going to review the results of all of the assessments given to that student as part of their special ed evaluation. Now, once those results are evaluated and Let's say the team decides that, yes, based on all of those result areas, this student is eligible for special education services under IDEA. If the student is found eligible, the team then works to develop an IEP that lays out goals, services, and supports tailored to that student's needs. So the evaluation doesn't just identify whether a child has a disability, it is the beginning process to guiding what comes next for their learning. Now, this whole referral process can sometimes feel like a lot of steps and paperwork. And in all honesty, it totally is. In my first year as a special education teacher, I remember feeling very blindsided by the amount of paperwork required of me that I felt I was not really prepared to do or to even know existed. And over time, I have learned that the process is designed this way for a reason, however great we think that process is. So first, this process, it helps protect against bias and inappropriate placements. Historically, students, especially students of color, English learners, and students from low-income backgrounds, have been over-identified for special education. A careful referral process helps make sure we are not confusing language differences, poverty, or behavior with a disability. Second, this process matters because it ensures equity, or does its best to ensure equity. The goal is to get students the right service for the right reason at the right time. That means that we do not rush kids into special education if their needs can be met with other supports. But we also do not delay when a disability is truly impacting learning. And finally, none of this at all works without collaboration. General educators bring day-to-day classroom insights, and special educators bring expertise in assessment, intervention, daily supports. And when those perspectives come together, we're able to make decisions that are fair, they're accurate, and again, in the best interest of our students. All right, we're going to switch gears just a little bit now and talk about what the breakdown looks like once students have gone through the referral process and are formally identified as having a disability per IDEA and an IEP. We'll start by looking at the national picture because even if you don't work directly in special education, these are your students just as much as they are my students. They're our collective students. So how many students are we talking about? The most recent data shows that about 7.5 million students ages 3 to 21 receive special education and related services under IDEA. 7.5 million students. That works out to roughly 15%, or about 1 in every 7 public school students in the country. Now, when we look at those numbers a little bit closer, we will often start talking about overrepresentation and underrepresentation. And here's just a quick explainer of what that means. Overrepresentation happens when a group of students are placed in special education at a higher rate than you'd expect based on their share of the total student population. Underrepresentation is the opposite, and it happens when a group of students are placed in special education at a lower rate than you'd expect. So as an example, we're looking at Group A here. So if Group A makes up 10% of all students in the United States, then we would expect to see that they would make roughly the same amount of students in special education. But if we look at our sample graph here, we see that Group A actually makes up 20% of students in special education. And that's way more than expected. And that is what overrepresentation is referring to. Now, also, if Group B here makes up 10% of all students in this fictional population, but they somehow only make up 5% of the students with disabilities, now we're looking at underrepresentation, because we would expect those numbers to be closer to one another. These patterns, over and underrepresentation, are really important because they tell us not just how many students have IEPs, but they also tell us whether the system is identifying some groups more often than others. And that raises big questions about equity. Now, let's look at representation by IDEA category. Among students who were served under IDEA in the most recent year of the data that is available, it shows that disability categories with the largest reported percentage of students were specific learning disabilities at 32%, speech language impairment at 19%, and other health impairments at 15%. Then there's a small jump here from autism to 12%. I wanted to pull up that graph that was on the side just a little bit more close up so we can look at these populated categories. So we have already mentioned these top 4 most populated areas. Then when we look at developmental delays, I know because the numbers aren't here, I'm going to just say them or read them out loud for you. Developmental delays are 7%. intellectual disabilities is 6% of the total population, and emotional disturbance makes about 4% of all students served under IDEA, respectively. Now, though not listed here, the following disability types account for 2% or less of students served under IDEA. That's multiple disabilities, so that is here, hearing impairments, orthopedic impairments, visual impairments, traumatic brain injuries, and deaf and blindness. As we recall from last week's lecture, those are some of the lower populated or low incidence areas of disability categories. Now, let's look at what the data shows about representation by biological sex among school-age students served under IDEA. According to the most recent figures, about 18% of male K-12 students receive services under IDEA compared with 10% of female students. In other words, male students are nearly twice as likely to be served, nearly. This breakdown by disability type also differs. So if you get into sex and then disability type, you can see lots of different patterns, and it's not always so cut and clear. So for example, in the category of specific learning disabilities, or SLD, we actually find that there is a larger female percentage than male percentage. Females have been identified as having 42% SLD, or in the SLD category, versus 30% of males. But in other categories like autism, the reverse is true. There are more male students, 16%, being identified as having autism than female students at 7%. So why does this imbalance exist? Part of it may be biological, but research also points to how referrals happen. Male students are more likely to act out or show disruptive behaviors that trigger a referral. Female students, on the other hand, may mask their difficulties by working harder, staying quiet, or simply going unnoticed. As a result, female students are generally going to be identified later in their schooling, and typically only when their needs become severe. These numbers remind us that biological sex, gender, however we want to word it, can play a powerful role in special education identification, not just who is referred, but also who slips through the cracks. Now, again, looking at this most recent national data available, the percentage of students served under IDEA was highest for American Indian students at 19% and Black students at 17%. I know it can be a little bit hard to see here, but American Indian / Alaska Native and Black students have the highest populated areas of being served under IDEA. And it was lowest for Pacific Islander students and Asian students at just 8%. So Pacific Islander had 12% and Asian, right down here, had 8%. When we break it down by type of disability, some other patterns emerge. For most racial and ethnic groups, the two most common categories are specific learning disabilities and speech language impairments. For Hispanic, American Indian / Alaska Native, and Pacific Islanders, these two categories alone, learning disabilities and speech language, make up more than half of all students served under IDEA. But for Asian students, the picture looks different. Autism is the most common category, representing 31% of all Asian students with disabilities. And then by comparison, autism ranges from only 8 to 14% for other student racial and ethnicity groups. So the takeaway here is that race and ethnicity strongly shape patterns of identification, not because disability itself is distributed differently across groups, but because of how our system responds to it. So going from the national to the state, we're going to look at just California trends. And in California, we see similar issues with representation that we do at the national level. There is an added complexity in California due to our overall population size as one of the most populated states in the country. All in all, California is home to about 12% of all students served under IDEA in the United States. So California makes up 12% of all IDEA in the US. Just for reference, most other states account for 1 to 3% of all students in the United States. California, because of its population size, makes up a very big chunk of IDEA students served under IDEA. That's important to know first. Now, we're going to look at some California-specific numbers here. This table is showing you the race and ethnicity categories on the left-hand side. This is our blue column. Now, besides this column, we have two pink columns that show how each of these race and ethnicity categories are represented in all of K-12 California schools by total number and then by percent. For example, the Pacific Islander group is the smallest group in California, and by percent, they actually make up less than 1% of the total California school population. In these orange columns on the right-hand side, we have the number of students with disabilities in California, listed by their race and ethnicity categories. And we also have their total and percent. Now, what we also see here is that in California, there are a total of 5.8 million students, and which means that 15% of these, or 865,000, are actually identified as having a disability within the state. Now, let's look at each category and see if we can identify any potential areas of over and under representation. I'll do a couple and then I'll have you do some in your Edpuzzle. So let's start with the Pacific Islander group here. We see that they make up less than 1% of the population for all of California students and less than 1% of the population for all California students with disabilities. That is relatively proportional. Great. Now let's look at American Indian or Alaska Native students who in the state of California make up less than 1% of the population. But when we look at how they're represented within special education, they're actually at the 1% mark. Now, it doesn't feel like it's a huge difference. However, this could mean that potentially there are hundreds to maybe even 1,000 students who are American Indian or Alaska Native who are being included in special education who may not necessarily have a need to be there. Whether or not that's entirely true is going to require a lot more investigation, but this is just looking at things proportionally. Now, for the category that's not represented or not reported, we have 1% of them of not reported race and ethnicities in California, and that's about represented in students with disabilities. Similar for students of Filipino background, they are about 2% of all of California's population and make up about 2% of students with disabilities in California. That's relatively proportional. Now, when we look at students of 2 or more races, they make up about 5% of all students in California and about 4% of all students with disabilities in the state. Now, not exactly equal. Maybe it has some areas to look into. We're going to have to dig deeper into those specific race areas, but all in all, maybe not the biggest discrepancy. Now, I want you to take a look at the next 4 categories: African American, Asian, White, and Hispanic Latino. And I would like you to identify whether you believe they are over-identified, under-identified, or if there's no specific issue that you're seeing. Now, when we talk about representation, it's not just about the numbers on a chart. These patterns have real consequences for students. In this context, we often use the word disproportionality to discuss the problem of over and under representation. Disproportionality means that certain groups of students are identified for special education at rates that are either higher or lower, over or under representation, than we would expect. And that's based on their share of the overall student population. But why does disproportionality even really matter? Well, first, disproportionality impacts access to services and opportunities. If a group of students is overrepresented, some of them may be receiving services they don't truly need, which can limit their access to general education opportunities. On the other hand, if a group is underrepresented, some students who do need support may not get identified at all, and they miss out on the services that could make a difference. Second, disproportionality contributes to stigma and lowered expectations. Being placed in special education can sometimes carry negative labels. There's no lying about that. For youth who are in those moments, they can carry some negative labels. If students are inappropriately identified, they may also be facing stereotypes about what they can achieve. Now they have this term disability, and I have a disability, and that might immediately bring their perception of what they can and cannot do down. And it's not just their perception, it's the perception of others as well. This is extremely harmful when it reinforces existing biases about race, ethnicity, gender, language. And finally, disproportionality reflects systematic inequities in schools. It shows us that identification is not always about actual differences in disability prevalence. Instead, it highlights how structural issues like bias in referrals, inequities in instruction, and lack of culturally responsive practices shape which students are more likely to be labeled. So, understanding representation isn't solely about analyzing data. It's about asking hard questions once you have that data in hand. Are we giving the right services for the right reasons at the right time? Are we doing this to students equitably? Are we supporting the students the way we intend to and the way that they deserve to be supported?